Because when I was in Springfield, they had the room for, she was black, but she was help, and her name was Vance, and I have a friend who's black and her name is Vance, and it just was kind of...
There was something else, because I've seen that exhibit, but there was an exhibit where she's in there with the gowns and all of the Washington ladies are surrounding Mrs. Lincoln, and there's a lady that's actually working on the dress, and that's Elizabeth Keckley. So they must have, it's been like several years since I've been down there, they may have, added something. Yeah.
But Sylvia, please permit me to put you on the spot. Please share with everyone a little bit more about how Elizabeth Keckley freed herself through her sewing.
Well, she was, like a lot of enslaved people, was transferred from one plantation to another one, very often within the same family, and they'd have cousins or in-laws and stuff, but she was like in Virginia. And then she was on plantations in Virginia and South Carolina, and then she got, sometimes, people who were in slavery used as wedding presents, and and she had these sewing skills because her mother was a seamstress, and she taught her those skills. And so she wound up in St. Louis, which was, Missouri was slave territory, or in the areas of Missouri, of St. Louis. And her owner actually hired her out as a seamstress and allowed her to keep some of her wages. And some of the masters did this. And she actually was able to save up enough, but she didn't have enough altogether. So what happened was, a lot of the ladies that she was allowed to work for, when they found out that she wanted to buy her freedom, they loaned her the money, and she continued to work, and she paid her back. Paid them back. She moved to Boston at one point, and they had these black coats. Was it Boston? Baltimore, my bad, Baltimore. It was Baltimore, Maryland she moved to, and they all had black coats, even though there was no slavery in the North. They still had repressive laws against blacks, and they didn't like black people coming in, taking over commerce and getting paid for it. And they had these ridiculous, they had like $1,000 bond you had to pay to stay in the city. And so this forced black people to move out, and she couldn't pay it, and so she wound up in Washington, D.C. And because of her skills, she met Mrs. Jefferson Davis and some other prominent ladies who were all in Washington before the South seceded. And so they said, well, Mrs. Lincoln, she needs a dressmaker, and she went, they were like, she said she thought that she wasn't going to get it because there were like 3 or 4 other ladies there who had been known in Washington, D.C. better than her, so she thought she wasn't going to get it, and Mrs. Lincoln liked her work, so she said, come back the next day. And she wound up being a confidant for Mrs. Lincoln, because Mrs. Lincoln was known to have kind of an unstable temperament. And so Elizabeth Keckley was very good at being able to deal with Mrs. Lincoln and get along with her in addition to her sewing skills. She was paid, yes, she was actually a seamstress, and she was paid for her work. And she was privy to a lot of the conversations between Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln while he was in the White House. She was there when little Todd died, and she comforted her. She had a son who grew up to actually fight in the Civil War, and he died in one of the camps, in one of the soldier camps. She supported various organizations that supported runaways, and then after slavery, black people trying, because they were just turned out with nothing very often, and they had nothing, and she supported runaway aid societies and people that helped these people who were like totally disenfranchised, and get them housing, get them medical care, get them food, getting them places where they could begin to earn their living. And she ended up being a seamstress or sewing instructor at Wilberforce University. She went in 1893 to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago as a sewing instructor and an instructor for domestic arts for Wilberforce University. And she had a number of her creations there, and she explained about domestic arts. She's founded several schools for young black women to teach these skills to young black women so that they could earn their own living. And she actually founded a home with one of the mutual aid societies that she founded, and she ended up dying there back in Washington, D.C., called the National Home for Indigent Black Women and Children. Because, after Reconstruction happened, there was all of this problem. Okay, now you all are free, now, go back, fade into the woodwork and stuff, and there was a lot of hostility and everything. So these societies were needed for decades, into the 1900s and everything. She died in 1906 in the age of 80 something. Yeah, so she had quite a life. She also wrote a book, 30 Years a Slave and 4 years in the White House. and she talked about her experiences, and she talked about some of the confidential conversations that went on with Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln. Her publisher, however, had letters that were confidential letters that she gave to him so that he could use them as references, but she said, I don't want them published. But he published them anyway. And so this was considered an embarrassment to Mrs. Lincoln and to her son Robert, and who didn't want her portrayed in a bad light. And so what happened was that she and Mrs. Lincoln fell out because Mrs. Lincoln felt she was betrayed, and they never really, repaired the rift and everything. Mrs. Keckley was trying to help Mrs. Lincoln out and follow instructions, but some stuff went bad. So, it was a very interesting story. Yeah.
Was there a Mr. Keckley?
Well, there was at one time. And actually, when she married this man, he had represented himself as being freed, even though this was still before the Civil War. And it turned out that he was actually not free. And he also had alcohol problems. And so they ended up parting their ways. Because she was trying to stick with him because she had married him. And he ended up causing her a lot of trouble. And, so she had enough to do with herself and her son, who was the child of one of the slave owners. And so they kind of just parted ways.